Hello and welcome. In today's video, we'll focus on a very specific aspect of how to get better at storytelling, and that is your credibility as a dashboard creator. There are a lot of videos on YouTube talking about how to build a perfect Power BI dashboard. Unfortunately, in my view, those videos are really good if you're trying to figure out how to build a beautiful dashboard, and they're actually really bad if you're trying to build a dashboard that's actually useful. So in this video, I will try to talk about how do you improve your credibility, and credibility can be improved in two ways. Number one, you show your competence, and number two, you show that you're actually honest and you're trying to anticipate your audience desires and the paths of analysis that are relevant to them. So what you want to do is you want to build a dashboard that actually is bringing the point home, that is explaining things the way they should be explaining, and that's not hiding things that should not be hidden if you want to make your point across. So the way we're going to do this, and I'm going to do this as a series moving forward, but for now what I figured we would do is we would take a bunch of public charts that are pulled off of public websites and Twitter, and I'm going to try to make my point using publicly available graphics, and then in subsequent videos, as I find more and more dashboards that are put together by, focused on specific business functions, sales, HR, marketing, and so forth, I'm going to work up some nerve and go into those specific dashboards. The reason I'm not doing it in this video is because I don't want to step on anybody's toes. People get sensitive and offended when you critique their work. I'm sure if people critique my work, I would be feeling pretty raw about this myself. So I think for the purpose of this video, let's focus on publicly available charts and go from there. But I will try to take public charts that talk about political things, that talk about things that are covered in the news, and I'm going to try to make a similar point that's relevant into the enterprise landscape. So the first thing, things first is, should we tell truth to our customers? The question is, can we get away from telling the truth? Let's say you're in IT, you control all of the sources, you control the flow of information, you control all of the outputs, you control who gets to see the information. So can you really, do you have the luxury of channeling your own agenda, your own kind of points of view to the audience? And the answer is probably no. And the answer is no is because of what normally we call spreadsheet hell and spreadsheet marks. But basically, you have plenty of power users in your organizations who have all or some access to the data, who can verify and tell the rest of the organization whether the corporate charts and dashboards are true or not. So let's take a look at what's happening in the world overall and see if that credibility is actually, we're going to talk about what's happening in the world, but making some references to what's happening into our companies. So the first thing that I notice kind of going through my feed is that people are moving away from news and websites. And the question is, why is this happening? Do you think this is happening because these news sites becoming more credible or less credible? Are they becoming more relevant or less relevant? Or is it because people are finding better sources of information? That's something to consider. One of the sites that I found that tried to provide an answer is the site that provided this chart for us. So if you look at this chart, the question is, are they trying to lie with this chart, or is this chart pretty fair and balanced? So what is the objective of this slide, of this chart? This chart basically is saying that, hey, take a look on the left. You have left-leaning, you have centrist, and you have right-leaning publications. And if you could look at it, regardless of where you are in a political spectrum, and we're not going to pull politics into this video at all, at least not yet. So we're just going to talk about the visualizations themselves. So the purpose of this chart and the objective of this article was that, hey, actually, the representation of both left and right-leaning views is pretty balanced. So by looking at it, you will see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 swim lanes and pretty equal representations of logo across all of them. The question is, how is this chart lying? Well, this chart is lying because it makes us feel like actually it is pretty balanced. What it's not telling us is what is the reach of each swim lane relative to number of daily views and relative to the consumption. So for example, if you look at this, at this chart, we have, and I don't spend any time on news, so I don't know which ones of them are popular, which ones of them are not very popular. So for example, you have a Federalist site, and then you have Fox News. So Fox News is a major syndicated news site. Federalist, I don't know much about. So, but they occupy about the same real estate on this chart. So my question is, looking at these logos, I recognize a lot more logos on the left than I recognize on the right. So my guess is that in terms of overall reach, if we were to represent each of this logo with the bubble that represents number of subscribers or monthly views, we're going to see some kind of disbalance. And people who put together this chart, my guess is they knew about this disbalance and they want to not talk about disbalance at all and basically display that we don't have any issues and we don't have any bias in our media. Let's look at the next slide. The next slide is talking about what's happening with Biden's approval rating across over time. And when I don't read the title, I just look at the chart by itself. It seems like Biden's bars are getting better. They're getting bigger. If I read the title, however, it says that Biden has slipped or dipped across months of NBC News polling. So something is not natural to me, right? So what is the problem here? If you're trying to talk about changes over time, then this chart is very misleading. You have to flip the chart around, because anything that's temporal, every time we want to show the trend, we want to have the time series somewhere in a chart in such a way that it's natural to us. So normally time is going to be going left to right, and that's how we can make this chart a lot more useful and a lot less misleading. The next one is this interesting chart. So here we're comparing the two potential presidential candidates based on number of issues. And again, if you just don't spend a lot of attention, you're saying, hey, this is a pretty good chart. The first feeling that you might get is that Biden is kind of starting from behind, but over time, or over some sort of metric, his indicators are actually getting better. One of the issues with this chart is that if you look at the issues, they are kind of grouped together. They're hard to read. You don't understand one issue ends and the next one begins. So it's a little bit cluttered. What's really missing here, though, is putting, not all of these issues are equally important for the voters, right? So it's basically the same. If I were to give my board a bunch of metrics, and I would just list them like this, and I would say, hey, we have revenue and profitability, then we have Twitter likes, and we have new products and R&D, right? So I could create a chart here with 10, 20 issues that have kind of representation of different scores. Then it could be very misleading, because what I'm doing is, instead of highlighting and sorting these issues based on their relative importance, I'm basically just randomly mixing these issues to I'm actually not sure what is the point of telling the story, right? So how these are sorted, I guess they're just sorted to show the improvement from left to right. So the way this chart is completely misleading is because it does not help us understand the relative importance of which issue with respect to the voting preference of potential voters. The next one talks about Biden's approval. And you're going to see a bunch of kind of election-heavy charts in here, which makes sense because that's kind of mostly what's in the news right now. So here we have two line charts, which basically technically represent the same thing, right? So we have approval and disapproval trend. And you probably, if you've seen a business dashboard, you have seen line charts. It's hard to imagine a business dashboard that does not have a line chart. However, what you need to think about is the following. Every time somebody's looking at the line chart, their first reaction is to understand the trend. If you are putting a chart in your dashboard, you have to think about, if somebody's looking at the trend, does this chart, is this formatted enough? Are the colors enough? Colors picked correctly? Is it too busy? Basically, is this helping the end user understand the trend? So what could make it difficult to understand the trend is overlaying two lines like this, right? Because now I have to pay attention and understand which one is approved, which one is disapproved. Again, that's a little bit distracting. So adding unnecessary series to the chart is what makes it difficult for me to understand the trend. Once I understand the trend, I never care about the trend. The next question is, what's driving the trend? What are my drivers? Why is it going up or down? What causes this trend? And that's what's missing in this article. So they're trying to talk about Latino population, voters, and independents and stuff like this. But the way I would do this is to use some sort of stack chart where I have different categories, right? And then basically help me either understand that the trend is driven by changing distribution of the categories, or if it's changing by having more people jumping on approve or disapprove bandwagon, right? So in and of itself, if it's bad news, you want to or good news, you want to have more. You want to have level 2 or double click level information available, because if you're just giving somebody a trend chart and does not provide the content, the context, then you're not going to be considered as a credible person to get information from, because clearly you don't understand how I use and what I use this dashboard for. Here's another one. This one is also election related. We have an interesting thing here. It's a donut chart. So technically speaking, or generally speaking, every time I see a donut chart or pie chart, I pause. So if you are familiar with the concept of bad smells, generally speaking, when you see a pie or donut chart on any report, you have to ask yourself, why did they choose to do this? So Occam residents will tell you, well, maybe they just don't know that pie charts or donut charts are typically frowned upon in the BI and storytelling community. But typically when you look at so this is NBC News, I would have to assume they have credible people putting together this report. So why did they select a donut chart? To make it relevant, I would say that generally speaking, I myself use donut charts, and I would use it in two scenarios. Scenario number one, it's a busy dashboard. For whatever reason, the customer, and sometimes customer is very forceful and very opinionated as to what they would like to see on the page. So customer says, I want this, this, and this. There'll be 20 different visuals, and they're all of the same type, let's say bar chart or something like this. And just to break things up, just to add a little bit more variety to the charts, if it's already a bad dashboard, I will say, okay, fine, I will have a pie chart or donut charts on there. Another time where I actually think donut charts or pie charts could be useful is a scenario where we use the pattern recognition part of our brain, right? So what happens if there's a certain distribution that we expect for our series, right? So for example, we would expect Haley to be a quarter of overall area of the chart, then, and that would be the pattern that my brain would easily recognize. Then having a donut chart or a pie chart would make it easy for me. For example, if I have to go county by county or state by state, or kind of go through a bunch of visuals, it would make me easy. It would make it easier for me to find a pattern that does not match what I expect. So in this kind of scenarios, pie charts usually are pretty good. Otherwise, if you see a pie chart, usually it means is they're trying to confuse you, or they're trying to make things look better than they appear. So what do you do when you absolutely positively want to not confuse your end users? Well, you use bar charts, right? So here we have an example where we had some sort of election results. Biden clearly won, and it's beyond any kind of doubt who is the winner and what the distribution of the votes were. And that works across multiple publications. You will see very similar visuals for different types of things. So anytime you would like to tell something that you don't want to have any ambiguity, you want to be crystal clear, and you have no reasons or no inspirations to mislead, you will see, particularly about numbers that are very important, you will typically see things like bar charts. You should never see things like pie charts or donut charts. And if you're confused about this, if you don't think that I'm making any sense, here's an example. And again, I don't want to be overly critical. Somebody probably put a lot of work into this. But generally speaking, when you see a bunch of pie charts or donut charts, you just kind of scratch your head and say, I don't understand what the hell is going on. Now, here's an example of Wall Street Journal, generally speaking, a relatively reputable publication that put a lot of work into writing this article about Elon Musk and all of the entanglements between him and his investors and board members. I didn't have the patience nor the time to go through the whole thing, but the article in itself was confusing. And then when I got to this visual, I was like, I don't understand what the hell is going on here. So what am I seeing in this chart? Well, I could see that out of all of these investments, Tesla is the largest investment by all. What is another thing that I see in this chart? Well, Antonio Gracias, I hope I don't butcher his last name, Gracias, seems to be involved in a bunch of different investments, and that's about it. So how could they have made this better? Again, I'm not sure what they're trying to tell with this. Number one, it seems like they're losing. I'm not sure how these investments are sorted. Maybe it would be interesting to sort them by timeline, maybe some other way, number of investors. Again, I don't know. It seems like there's an opportunity lost with this. But if there's anything that this chart does, and that's an example of something that's extremely confusing, and this is a case where if you put some confusing visual, if I'm a member of your board, and you're trying to tell me that everything is going on and you show me a chart like this, it's going to work against you. Here's another one. So we have a really great news. We have acceleration in job creation, yet somehow the stock market is not responding with the green light, right? So what's going on? Why is it that the jobs are growing and markets are shrinking? Well, that harkens back into this whole trend conversation. Every time you have a trend, the first thing is people are going to say, okay, awesome, so it's trending up, but the next question is, why? Well, in this case, we could make some wild guesses. One of the guesses could be that it's not the quantity of jobs that's increasing, but the quality of jobs that's decreasing. So for example, if by looking at this chart, I could tell two things. I could say, is this growth because of part-time jobs or full-time jobs, right? So basically, what they could do is they could break each bar into two sections, two colors, part-time and full-time, and there I would see the full story, right? What's driving this growth? Is the quality of jobs increasing or decreasing? Because if you're telling me that number of jobs are created is growing, but quality of jobs is shrinking, it's getting worse, then that would perfectly explain why the markets are not responding and resonating with this good news. Here's another one. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but here we're talking about the GDP numbers, right? And the challenge with GDP is some measures really beg for having another measure to be on the chart. A lot of times one measure is enough because all we're looking for is a trend. But in this case, I would really want to know, I would want to overlay the inflation on top of it. Now, by looking at this chart, they talk about seasonally adjusted annual rates. But when you look at GDP, really the question is whether it's real GDP, whether it's adjusted for inflation. So when you show me GDP growth, I really need to understand what am I looking at. Am I looking at numbers that are adjusted for inflation or not? The same with market, right? We almost never see market numbers or that are adjusted for inflation, and that makes it a little bit misleading, particularly when you have a bad quarter in terms of inflation that's let's say over 6 or 8%, like we had a couple, I think last year. Here's another one. So now we do have two metrics, right? But now the two metrics kind of make me scratch my head again. So here, Wall Street Journal, again, a very reputable publication, particularly when it comes to talking about finance and what's happening in the financial world, is trying to make a point that every time Fed hiked up the federal rate, we had improvement in GDP. And that is real GDP growth, which is commendable. So Wall Street Journal gets it, that every time you talk about GDP, you have to call out whether you're looking at real GDP or not adjusted GDP. So my question to you is it conceivable, does it make sense that the GDP will grow literally in the same quarter or in the same month where the Fed is making a change to the rate, right? So think about this. I have a faucet and I have a 100-foot hose, and I'm trying to fill up my pool. I open up my faucet. How long does it take for the water to start entering the pool? Well, it probably will take a bit of time, right? There's always lag. And when you look at these macroeconomic indicators, it's inconceivable that something as impactful or as huge as the market, as the Fed rate, would resonate with the real GDP growth almost immediately. So if you came to me and say, hey, there's correlation, it's not causation, but look at this amazing correlation. Again, your credibility, you have to be really thinking about whether the two variables that you're putting on the graph, does it make sense? Or whether it's going to ask more questions, raise more questions rather than answer any questions. Now, this is another one. So two-speed economy. So this article, again in WSJ, is talking about that, hey, potentially we might have a hard situation in our hands. Look at the credit card delinquency rates, right? So the numbers of mortgage and credit card delinquencies were shrinking. And then all of a sudden, in the beginning of 2022, the delinquencies for credit cards started to go up and they doubled. So the question is, should I freak out or is this okay? Well, the article is kind of saying, it's like, hey, it's confusing, but maybe it's not that bad. Look at the mortgage rates, right? So perhaps there's no reason to freak out and do something with your investments. Things are actually okay. Well, are they lying or is this honest analysis? Well, if you look at what's happening with the annual home sales, you will see that 22 and 23 look dramatically different from 2021. So we see that number of the home sales almost half. Again, I'm exaggerating a little bit of what they were just 2 years ago. So what does that mean? Well, that means is that when we look at mortgages, we need to really understand what makes up the risk portfolio of these mortgages. So if we see, so for example, how can we increase this chart? Well, maybe we need to break this down by rural versus urban home sales, right? Maybe we would see that urban home sales are shrinking and rural home sales are growing, right? So, I mean, there may be something in that column that explains the dynamic, and maybe the profile of urban home buyers is different to profile of rural home buyers. Maybe the average home price is different. So there may be a bunch of different things that describe the folks who are buying houses that is driving that delinquency rate, right? So if the economy is such that people who are likely to be delinquent on their mortgage are not just able to buy a home anymore, right, because of the higher interest rates and other things, then that would show us that, hey, mortgage rate delinquencies are actually good, but again, that's not telling us the real story because we're just not looking at the same people who we were looking at 2 years ago, right? So should we freak out about credit card delinquencies? I personally would. So the next one is, I just wanted to talk about this because one of the things that I really like, and this is something that we should do internally in our corporate reports, is incorporate elements to help end users provide feedback on the quality of our reporting and our information. So here's something that I thought was really cool from Newsweek. So they recognize that there is a perception of bias and not being fair in reporting and covering certain events. So they've added this little feature to their page where that allows an end user to say, hey, I read your article, I familiarized myself with your analysis, and guess what? I think it's unfair and left-leaning, or it's unfair and right-leaning, or I think it's pretty fair. So what that allows me to do, it allows me to get the feedback from my customers and over time get better. And actually what's interesting is if my customers are left-leaning, then they would probably be picking fair a lot more than if my customer's right-leaning, they would be saying that it's unfair left-leaning, right? Talking about the same article. So you have to be really careful to mix and match what your customers are telling you with what you know about your customers, right? So you can't just take any kind of feedback as gospel. You have to put any information, any signal into a context, and so that it's useful. Because if you don't, again, it's going to skew you in the wrong direction. So that concludes the critical part, and I just want to ask you guys a question. I found a really interesting chart. It's not very interesting in terms of the richness of information, but it's an interesting use case that I want to pose a question for you guys. Basically, I'm a big fan of showing metrics as an index, right? So here they're looking at jobless claims during two eras, during dot-com bust, which is a blue line, and a biodynamics modern era, which is a black line. And what's interesting here is we don't know how many people were leaving, and the size of the country was different between now and, let's say, 15, 20, 25 years ago. So what the index allows us to do, it allows us to normalize these two metrics and just talk about, okay, let's just talk about how things changed over time, right? So in year one of dot-com bust, jobless claims went up, and then they started going down, and then the same was happening is happening during biodynamics times. So what's cool about this chart is that you're able to compare two metrics without being devolved and sidetracked by the context, comparing apples to apples. So I'm posing my question to you. If this looks interesting, then leave a comment for us, because I would love to do a deep dive on how to build this sort of type of reporting, so that you can arbitrarily pick, for example, a year and say, using, let's say 2015 as an index, show me the market share. I think that could be an interesting video. So please let me know in the comments if this is interesting, and I'll be happy to do one for you. That concludes this short presentation. Hope you guys had fun, and hope you found this interesting. So if you like this sort of analysis, please let us know. I could do this maybe weekly, bi-weekly, whatever frequency makes sense. I think somebody who is just beginning with storytelling, it's good for them to hear when somebody critiques somebody else's charts, as long as it's not their charts. So please let me know how you guys feel, and thank you for your time, and looking forward to your comments. Thanks. Bye.